Shin is the Acting Research Director at IDEAS, and she will be our moderator for today. Over to you, Yashin.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. And thank you, Prof, for the insightful and very comprehensive presentation. I think Prof has talked about how NEP is a strategic plan for nation building with the overriding objective to achieve national unity. So Prof has also demarcated the impact of NEP on social cohesion into 3 periods, which is from 1971 to 2008, where generate episodes of tension, but still with general atmosphere of peace and social cohesion due to rapid development and rising prosperity. Then he talked about the second period, where 2008 until February 2020, which is a period of rising ethnic and religious polarization and tension. And from February 2020 onwards, with the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, how any relation seems to have stabilized again. And Prof has also talked about how nations are not merely a product of envisioning of the state leaders, they are also a product of how people interpret their experiences. And throughout the years, he has analyzed and expounded on how Bangsa Malaysia has been envisioned by the leaders, but how has it also been sidelined throughout the years in policy making, and how different leaders have taken different political branding instead. So rather than focusing on the building of Bangsa Malaysia, attention has been on the dichotomizing of Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra, which has the othering and splitting consequences. And it's also one of the unintended consequences of NEP. So as a result, the Rukun Negara objectives have not been fully achieved. So, but we do see an opportunity in COVID-19 and in the rise of more solidarity among the people. And so what maybe this is the time we can talk about how does are there new opportunities to rebuild the nation? Are there new opportunities to come together to think about what does Bangsa Malaysia means to us, and can we move forward from here and reconcile and talk about how can we come together as one nation? Yeah, so I would like to introduce our first panelist of the day, which is we have 2 esteemed panelists with us besides Prof Rahman, which is the first is Netusha, and the second is Professor James Shin. So I will introduce Netusha first, and then after that, followed by Professor James Shin. So Netusha Naidu is the president of Imagine Malaysia, a non-profit education project aiming to broaden understanding of Southeast Asia, specifically Malaysian history, providing a platform to learn and critically discuss alternative historical narratives. Through this work, she strives to advance the role of public history in social policy, peace building, and national integration. Netusha recently completed a Master of Philosophy in World History at the University of Cambridge, funded by the Tunku Abdul Rahman Fund, and previously a Bachelor of Arts with Honours in International Relations at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Netusha is also a member of Forces of Renewal for Southeast Asia, also known as FORSI. Yes, over to you, Netusha.
Hi, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank IDEAS for inviting me to respond to Prof Rahman's paper. It's quite an honor having read, many of your papers, Prof, and of course, like alongside Professor James Shin, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with prior to this for our Tanpa Perkauman and Anti-Racist History of Malaysia campaign with IDEAS. And James has really helped us to look through and examine, especially how we approach the issue of separatism and national identity in Sabah and Sarawak. So yeah, and of course, thank you everyone for being here and spending your morning talking about something really, I guess, really complicated, as we saw in the paper presentation just now, and there's just a lot to digest, right? And I think like the timeliness of this discussion is here. I just wanted to share like the anecdote. Just recently, I attended Professor Wang Gungwu's lecture for the 4th Syed Hussein Alatas Memorial Lecture in National University of Singapore. And during his lecture, he shared stories about being at the front lines of this kind of framing of what is the Malaysian nation post-independence, and how he looks back now at this like what seems to be a very uncritical space, and the need to like move forward in terms of how we think about nation. And at the end of his presentation and the Q&A section, Professor Wang Gungwu ended up just saying that he actually does not believe in the concept of a nation state or working towards a kind of like national identity. Instead, he said that the future of the world is to actually reject the concept of nation states, and because in his idea it's completely fiction. So I think like that is where the debate stands as today, and a lot of it's compounded by the inequalities that have come to bear because of the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine apartheid being like a major issue that really shows like this like decline in the ability to compound ourselves and like constrict ourselves within like a very Eurocentric idea like the nation state. So that's probably where I would focus my critique of this question, right, about Bangsa Malaysia. Is there any hope for a concept that comes from a nebulous shell of like colonial categories? And what is our role as like the new generation or young generation of Malaysians who may be more aware and critical of the fact that colonial categories of race, or in this way I'm paraphrasing Sumit Mandal's opening of his book Becoming Arab, where he talks about how many scholars are uncritically reproducing very essentialist ideas of race as they're putting forward their critique. And what is the future of talking about race relations in a way that we can reframe it so that we actually don't give so much power to this and actually free ourselves? I think for me, the first step is definitely confronting the real issues at hand. It is one thing to like say we want our governments to like come up with fluffy, pretty looking like policy papers, which they do keep doing, and wanting to like define and flesh out what is that vision of a nation. But how can we truly know that this is like what everybody wants when there's one, the issue of trust deficit. Two, as we can also observe, you know, Prof Rahman gave us this really extensive timeline of policies and initiatives, right? But we also witness like the active and very coordinated erasure and suppression of like the issue of discrimination in our society, right? So can we actually really materialize and think about concepts of Bangsa Malaysia if we ourselves at all levels, you know, from a societal level to like institutional, can't even grapple with confronting racism and eradicating discrimination in our everyday social interactions? That is the main purpose of Tanpa Perkauman's campaign. You know, we create all these resources because ultimately it's not just about looking into the past and learning about different ways of how to conceptualize nation, but it's also that the fact that the future of nation or like social cohesion, but I don't really like the word social cohesion. I think it's very artificial, but more like resilience, right? We're trying to build a resilience of society. It's really contingent to the fact whether we actually like can personally question and interrogate our everyday interactions and move beyond racialized thinking. And I think this was like really beautifully captured in Sumit Mandal's paper on trans-ethnic solidarities. I saw some of the points kind of resonate with Prof Rahman's paper as well, where he talks about, you know, in the conclusion that colonial era racialization, which I do feel like, we're still living in the shadow of that, a lot of these like arrangements or lines of thinking. Just the difference is that obviously we have neoliberal capitalism in the picture, framing a lot of this and hardening racialized thinking. But it doesn't completely reflect our social realities, as Prof Rahman also like pointed out very clearly. So instead, like something that he pointed towards too, and also in his recent presentation, which I had the privilege of responding to the paper by Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, 3 elements are important in this conversation. How can we include elements of mutual empathy? That's one. Inclusion, and third, equality of identities in these conversations to reframe our understanding of diversity, ethnic diversity. Because as far as we are concerned, and we see throughout this entire like pattern or timeline of managing Malaysian society, is that race is positioned as a problem. And where does that come from? In colonial period. So how do we move forward from race being the center of the problem that needs to be solved, right? And there's also this other point which I think is worth like having an honest conversation about, because we need to reevaluate this like multiple levels of social, political, economic interactions, and where we like need to question, interrogate, and try to turn over and eradicate race. I think that one of these excellent points pointed out was in Amita Malhi's paper about the National Harmony Bill. And in that paper, there's one particular point that stood out, because this is something I also think about a lot. As Prof Rahman said, adversity brings us closer, right? But there's also this idea that I think she called it scandal cycles, where race becomes like a point of crisis for like political change or turning point. And when there's like when we're about to go somewhere more progressive, do you realize that suddenly like bam, there's like a scandal? For instance, like the ratification of ISET, right? ISET could have been very beneficial as a framework to address discrimination in Malaysia. But what happens? So there's a statement or any kind of initiative that questions this very ethno-nationalist like understanding of like our society. If it's considered pushing the boundaries of acceptability, because it's questioning like Malay hegemony ultimately, and not just Malay hegemony, it's Malay capitalist hegemony, then there's going to be a big media scandal. Then everyone starts to like argue, fight. It attracts attention from all facets of society, right? And as she said in that paper, that it irreversibly shifts public policy debates and outcomes signaled by each provocation. So ultimately, what happens at the end is that we don't actually have any real substantial conversations, or TLDR, too long, didn't read, like a millennial thing. But anyway, like in short, like how Toni Morrison says, right, it's racism is ultimately the distraction, and it's still a distraction. And I do think that this idea of like wanting to keep thinking of how to frame nation is also a form of distraction from the foundational problems, which is, discrimination and addressing and correcting discrimination, right? Maybe I sound too practical, I'm not sure. But as a young person and growing up in a very racist society and being a victim of racism at every level, I'm sick and tired. And as a historian, I think like I'm trying to incorporate that in my work and to imagine Malaysia's work. So ultimately, like then also we observe in Prof Rahman's paper, something that Shaharuddin Maruf noted in his paper, his book, Malay Ideas on Development. He talked about how Malay capitalism is sine qua non for peace and good race relations, right? So like whatever, and this kind of connects every time we need a a scandal cycle. We need like a crisis to come in and to justify and reinforce Malay ethno-nationalist and capitalist rule. And this is a big part of the resiliency of the government, ruling coalition, and like our political structures. So ultimately, I think like as a young Malaysian, my question is, why can't our politicians attempt to break those scandal cycles? Why do they not take an active role in trying to redirect conversations and try to evolve and transform our political culture to move away? And I think that's where the real work needs to start. And it needs to end. And all this cop-outs about, oh, you know, I'm the only one who thinks about it. One day we'll have a mature conversation. Oh, it does not allow for that. I'm just one person, I can't do it. No, that's not good enough. And, you know, we deserve better, the young generation of Malaysians. So that's kind of where I'm going to stop. And I hope that I look forward to Prof Rahman's response, Prof James Shin, you know, especially like the fact on how much resentment and unresolved grievances there are in the communities of Sabah and Sarawak, and real substantial problems, right? Statelessness is one, right? And lack of access to resources for upward social mobility. This is something that affects many of us. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and looking forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Netusha. Maybe just pass over to Prof Rahman to make some response to that, like maybe a short one to what Netusha has said, before passing on to James.
Oh, I would rather hear from James first before
Okay,
I give
sure.
my response. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me introduce our second panelist. Professor James Shin is a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania and was an inaugural director of the Asia Institute Tasmania. He is an expert on the governance issue in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Before the University of Tasmania, James was the foundation head of the School of Arts and Social Sciences, Monash University, Malaysia. James is a senior fellow at the Jeffrey Char Institute on Southeast Asia, a senior visiting research fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and on the international editorial board for the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs. His views are regularly sought by major news agencies around the world, including New York Times, the Financial Times, BBC World, and Bloomberg. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off by thanking IDEAS for the kind invitation for me to say a few words about NEP and 50th anniversary of NEP. And I'm very pleased to be in this panel because I was very pleased to hear that my good friend, Professor Rahman Embong, has actually written his portion of IDEAS 50th anniversary book back here. I think Professor Embong has written a very, very good paper. It's very comprehensive, and I think it covers a lot of areas. And I think his paper is actually a very good place to start a conversation about this whole idea of NEP, the whole idea of national identity, and this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, and whether it is possible for a country like Malaysia. I would also like to bring in my co-commentator, Netusha, which I think represents the voice of the young people. I think the sort of issues she raised is essentially the sort of issues raised by the younger Malaysians as they grapple with this idea of Bangsa Malaysia. The big difference between third generation and people of my generation is that they grew up in the era of NEP. Basically, they grew up in the era of NEP touches on every facet of Malaysian life. And this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, as Professor Rahman has reminded us, was an idea that was picked up by Mahathir. He was selling it for a while. Then when he realized that it was not effective, he dropped it immediately. I'm not going to add on a lot of stuff because I think a lot of things that I wanted to say has already been spoken about, Natasha. But I just wanted to bring up several key points, which I think should be added if we're going to have a discussion about the NEP and national identity. I think one of the key reasons why the NEP is such a difficult topic to deal with Malaysians is that there were actually a lot of supporters of the NEP. Professor Rahman talked about the survey done on among the Malay population, but that is just one part of the picture. The real picture of happening at NEP is that at the elite level, there's actually a lot of elites from all ethnic groups who are actually strong supporters of the NEP. Now, the reasons I said that, and I think a lot of people will be surprised when I say a lot of Chinese groups for the NEP, is because a lot of them actually made a lot of money from the NEP. They actually do not want to replace the NEP. The reason is very simple, right? With the NEP, government procurement, all the major infrastructure projects, and you will always have the NEP component or the Bumitra agenda. Now you have to ask yourself, once you carve up all these big projects to the Bumitra component, who is going to benefit for it? It will be the Malay elites, but they are not the one doing the jobs. They are the one who has joint ventures with the Chinese tycoons, with the certain Indian tycoons. And these are the people who need the NEP in order to keep their business afloat. Without the NEP, a lot of these businesses have to compete openly in the business world. And I suspect a lot of them actually do not have a model for operating in the normal business world. Their entire business model is based on the NEP. They go to the government and say that, we want 70% of this project because this is the booming component. Now, I can give you a very, very simple example of how this elite approach towards NEP, right, can actually derail anything you want to do in terms of reforms of NEP. Now, the key line is 2008. As mentioned by Professor Rambon, in 2008, the Barisan Nasional lost two-thirds majority. Shortly 1 year after that, they got rid of Patla and they brought in Najib Razak. Najib Razak, despite all his faults, immediately understood that we need to reform the Malaysian economy and we need to reform the NEP. So one of the first things he did was to set up a NEAC, a National Economic Action Council, and he brought in a lot of experts who really knew what was happening in the Malaysian economy. And one of the things they spent a lot of time and resources on was how to reform the NEP. So if you read the part one of the original report, not the final report, the original report, basically the report asked the Malaysian government to get rid of the NEP and replace it with something else. That was deemed unacceptable to the Malay establishment. Najib tried very hard to sell this idea to the Malay establishment by saying that, if we get rid of NEP, replace it with something else, over the long run, it will be better for everybody. That, of course, did not happen. Huh? The pushback was so strong, Najib was forced to back down. And in the end, the final report that was published was basically saying that, we just need to go to new areas, but we keep the NEP. So that's an example of why it is so difficult to reform the NEP. Secondly, I think the issue of national identity and national unity, I think we need to sort of compartmentalize it and say that on the one hand, you got all these academic studies, all these surveys saying that people like the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. But the people who take part in the surveys are not the one who actually decide which way policy will move. I think the reality is that there are certain things in the Malaysian political system that makes national unity of Bangsa Malaysia impossible with the current institutional structures, right? And I'll just go through a few, right? The first, obviously, is that, the ideology of Ketuhanan Melayu, it is still very strong among all the mainstream Malay parties, okay? And this is really inconsistent with this idea that, that Malaysia is a diverse place. Bangsa Malaysia says that everybody has a place in the sun. This ideology of Ketuhanan Melayu basically says that the Malays are always number one, everybody else can be 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's inconsistent with this idea of Bangsa Malaysia. Secondly, if you look at the structure of political parties in Malaysia, right, for the longest time, all the political parties that preach diversity, multiracialism has not succeeded. The parties that actually push to champion one single race or one single religion, these are the most successful parties. So that's the reason why this model works for them and they keep reinforcing it, racial approach and religious approach. Another area which I think would impede the creation of Bangsa Malaysia, national unity, is of course the rise of political Islam. This is something that was not addressed in Professor Rahman's paper, but I'm sure he's well aware of it. This has major implications because their view of Malaysia is very different from what everyone else is thinking. Okay, those people who keep pushing for political Islam or use political Islam as a platform, basically the view is a similarist view of Malaysia, which I suspect a lot of the non-Malay communities in Malaysia will reject. And this comes back to the earlier point I made about difficulties in trying to sell a very good idea. The idea may be good on paper, but it's very difficult to sell it in real life. And I think Netusha also alerted us to that. And finally, my final point is, and this is mentioned already, which is the East Malaysian version. The East Malaysian version is completely different. Even the way they talk about Bangsa Malaysia or national unity for the East Malaysian side, the narrative is completely different to all the discussion on the Semenanjung side. So I think I'll stop here. I just want to make one more point, which I think is a really, really important point when we discuss this, which is that one of the major divides in Malaysia, right, besides the political side, is actually this whole issue of the economic system that we live under, capitalism. Capitalism and social media, interestingly enough, are actually used as very, very powerful tools to divide Malaysians more than ever. And the reason why they're being used as this tool is because the elites or the Malay establishment or the Malaysian establishment, consisting of the non-Malay elites as well, right? These are the people who control the capitalism system we have in Malaysia, and they've latched onto social media to divide the people further. Without dividing the people further, basically, they cannot hang on to their influence, their power, and their resources. So ironically, in some ways, even though Malaysia has embraced capitalism, part of capitalism works in such a way that it actually destroys any chance that we can actually have some form of national unity in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Yes, before I pass to Professor Rahman, maybe could you elaborate more? I think you talk about how the East Malaysian version of Bangsa Malaysia is different from the West Malaysia. Could you elaborate further on that?
Sure. So I think this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, if you look at it from the Semenanjung perspective, right, it is about bringing all the different races together. In more recent years, it's about bringing the Malays and the non-Malays together. In the East Malaysian mind, right, from day one, right, they don't have this idea of bringing people together. Because the unique thing about East Malaysia is that from day one, even before the formation of Federation of Malaysia, is that there was never one ethnic group that constitutes a majority, right? So everyone grows up with this idea that our society is always plural. There's no such thing as domination. And that the idea of so-called Bangsa Sarawak or Bangsa North Borneo or whatever is all about acceptance of other people, because you're always mixing with other people all the time. So very early on, you're exposed to this idea that, that you yourself are not unique. You will always have to rely and work with other people. So this is what I mean when I said their mindset is completely different. Here, when you talk about Bangsa Malaysia, if you ask the ordinary people in Semenanjung, right, immediately the thing that comes into their mind is the Bumiputera, non-Bumiputera dichotomy, the Malays, non-Malays, Islam, non-Islam. It's basically, sort of a two-horse race or two issues race. But in East Malaysia, I can tell you, the people over there don't have this sort of mindset. Their mindset is completely different because of the demography and also because of their culture and their history. As you know, right, Sarawak was ruled by a private group family, English family, for more than 100 years. And in North Borneo, it was ruled by a private company. So it's a very, very different kind of mindset. I think one of the big damages done by the British colonial administration was that they imported this idea basically from India and Myanmar, this idea of divide and rule, right? And of course, it was so successful in this part of the world that they exported to places like Fiji, Suriname, and all of other places. Because it's a clear distinction between the way the British ruled the colonial empire, say, compared to the French in Indochina. So it is very clear that a lot of things we see today, whether we like it or not, a lot of it is also due to colonial legacy. So I was really pleased that Professor Rahman has managed to weave that into his narrative, at the end of the Second World War, all the different groups, including the communists, had come together to create the idea of new nation. But my point is that I'm sorry to hold a very pessimistic view. I'm saying that there are institutional barriers you need to overcome before you can even talk about this whole idea of national unity. And my point is that if you don't deal with this elite stranglehold on Malaysian politics, I think a lot of this discussion will end up, as discussion at the academic level.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I think both James and Netusha also talk about how moving beyond race and also acceptance being like the core to having a more cohesive and also reconciling the different ethnic groups. Yeah, over to you, Professor Rahman. Do you have any thoughts and points to respond to what James and Netusha has said?
Thank you, Yashin, and thank you to Natasha and also to James. As I've said in my presentation, the NEP is a very, very complex question, very complicated and difficult to handle. And this can be seen from the responses from our two panelists that yes, it is indeed a very difficult question to handle, but we have to handle it nevertheless. I think there are several points made by both panelists, which I just want to highlight. I don't have much time to tell much. I think what Prof James Shin said at the end, that the unique thing about Sabah and Sarawak, they never have the experience of one ethnic group dominating the others, and their conception of society is always plural. And that kind of thinking is definitely different from Semenanjung. But I think that kind of thinking is something that we have to study deeper, and the strength of that kind of thinking is mutual acceptance of the other, and this has been seen and demonstrated by the various groups in Sabah and Sarawak. I think that is one point, and that can be the basis for further discussion about Bangsa Malaysia. The second point is about the institutional barriers and the elite entrenchment. So much vested interest they have in maintaining the kind of structures that they have today. Yes, definitely that is the elephant on the table that has got to be addressed if we want real change. And I didn't touch on it because that was touched yesterday, but I can see that in the discourse, in the discussions, that the reluctance to move beyond. I mean to talk about Bangsa Malaysia now in the policies is partly due to this. That it is not in keeping with their interest to have an open discussion or discourse on the subject, is in order to keep intact what they have. But I do agree. Yes, we have got to put institutional barriers on the table. We have got to put the vested interest of the elite on the table if we want to move beyond the 50 years of the NEP. Now, the third point I would like to just say briefly here. How much time do I have for Yashin?
Yes, you still have time. Please go on. Yeah.
Okay. Is what has been raised by Natasha. Congratulations, Natasha. As I like that, because as a young person, you voice your views in a forthright manner, and a spade is a spade. And I think that's what you need. And I agree with you that the issues of discrimination, of inequalities, of racism are real, and this has got to be tackled. I mean, any policies that don't address this, we could just perpetuate what has been going on in the last 50 years or even longer than 50 years. And it is an offshoot of I mean, these are what do you call it, the unintended consequences of the long policy of the NEP. discrimination anywhere. People, I mean, so I suppose, I don't know, I haven't read the bill, the proposed bill that was supposed to be tabled in during Najib's time, but I do not, and I do not know whether this issue of discrimination was taken up or not. But I think that this is a subject that can be deepened further as we go along. And in what way Malaysia's way forward, if the discrimination continues, how can we remain a cohesive, united nation society if we don't deal directly with the issue of discrimination? Yes, I agree with that. And the campaign of Tanpa Perkauman is a good campaign. I agree. It's good, but it is not an easy campaign because there'll be obstacles, just like we see the obstacles of Bangsa Malaysia. But it has got to be done, and I think it's good that the young people are taking it up. That Tanpa Perkauman, which means that treat everybody as a human being, not based on your ethnic identity or religious identity or whatever. But if you are a citizen of the country, a human being, and therefore don't discriminate based on kaum or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the gist of what the Tanpa Perkauman is. Now, I think there is a distinction between the colonial racial categories and the concept of nation. Unfortunately, in Malay, the word bangsa is a bit, it can stretch either way. It is in Malay, it is taksa, which means that it can mean kaum, it can mean nation, it can mean race in bangsa, in the word bangsa itself. Though in English, the term nation is quite clear. Now, when I use the term Bangsa Malaysia, I do not mean race. I don't mean Malaysian race. I know the former chief editor of the Straits Times called it Malaysian race. I think that is wrong. Yes, race is a category in the Bansi, in the census created by the colonialists. But Bangsa Malaysia is not a category created by them. It is an attempt at redefining the people of diverse ethnic groups into one political entity, into one political identity. If they so wish, you can have only one Bangsa Malaysia if the people want it. If the various generations of the people want it. But that does not fall under the category of the categorizations by the colonialists. It's different. It's not an ethnic-based category, just like the term Melayu, as proposed in the constitutional proposal of Putra MCJ. It is not based on race. It is not based on blood or non-ethnic origin, but it's based on patriotism. And in a similar manner, Bangsa Malaysia takes that cue as well. It is not a racial category. Now, the other point is that you refer to Professor Wang Ganggu's lecture on nation building. I missed that lecture. I would love to listen to it. But the gist of what you have said, that you paraphrase Professor Wang, that the future, according to what Prof Wang, as you reported, is that it's not nation states. It is a fiction. I don't want to comment based on I don't want to comment on that. But I would say that the era of nation building in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, is still there. When that future, when nation states are no longer relevant, I don't know. It may take many, many decades, many, many years, many centuries, perhaps. But Europe said that before. When in the 60s, when I was a student in the UK, when we talk about nations and nationalism, they say, no, we should be talking about internationalism. But they are going back to nationalism now. Ethno-nationalism, in fact. Ethno-populism and all that. So I don't think we can wish away nation states from existence until a certain period. So for the moment, we have to live with it and to define it in a ways that perhaps can suit the purpose of overcoming discrimination, the purpose of promoting pluralism, mutual respect and acceptance of the other, instead of we keep othering the others, why not including everybody, the others? I think that kind of discourse should be on the table. And I don't think we should put forward the idea that nation state will be a fiction, because it will not, it is a real thing at the moment. It may become fictional later on, I don't know. So, but the content of it, I think it matters, because get rid of discrimination, get rid of inequality. But how to do it? Of course, there are institutional barriers. Of course, there are vested interests. They are very well entrenched to ensure that it cannot happen. But we have got to move on. And then on the question of Bangsa Malaysia, I put towards the end of my presentation, what really is the thinking of the people? Do they want it? Or is it just a figment of the imagination of the leaders and those people who think that that should be the way forward? I think it's a good thing to assess that by asking the survey. Now, James mentioned that those people who participate in the survey are not the policymakers. Correct. But at least we have the evidence, what they want. And then in this, people talk about evidence-based policy making and all that, and perhaps with that kind of evidence, then we can say something that this is based on what people want, and policymakers have to take note of that. And the point is about politicians is that they are very short-termist, and they have got a 5-year perspective. The worldview is of 5 years, the next election. But we have got to live with this beyond 5 years. It's beyond generations. So how should it be? I mean, if we remain, we have a state, but if we think that Bangsa Malaysia is not the answer to that, then what kind of solution should we have to address the people? I mean, the content of it is, of course, we have got to address discrimination, inequality, but we have lived over 60 years or at least 50 years with that kind of institutional structures, and also with that kind of thinking framework. And now we have got to address that. To bring about change, that thinking framework, to wean people away from that kind of idea, to accept the new idea, is a very tough task. I mean, this is one of the things said yesterday's session, weaning people from the what do you call that, the clash of those ideas, and to accept the new ideas, the alternative discourse and so on. Okay, yes.
Yeah. Prof, yes, I think in your paper you mentioned about intersectionalities of identities, that Bangsa Malaysia is one of the political identities that can coexist with the other ethnic identities and other identities that one has. Would you want to share more on that? I think that's the important point of how Bangsa Malaysia is one of our identities. It might be a salient identity. It might not be to some people as well. But, yeah.
Thanks, Yasin. Yes, identities are fluid, identities are multiple, and if they intersect at certain levels or at certain points, you can be a Malay, but at the same time you are a Muslim. You are also assume a state-based identity, Bangsa Johor, for example, gender identity, and so on. But and for women, can be single mothers, is also an identity. Youth, generation identity. So it intersects at some points or other. But I think the Bangsa Malaysia, which is a national identity, does not negate the various types of other identities, because I mean, people remain with their identities, whatever their identities are. But in terms of the country, in terms of the nation, then what are we? We are not, well, we are Keluarga Malaysia lah. I mean, according to the latest, the latest tagline, we are part of Keluarga Malaysia, yes. But that is not an identity in that sense. It's not a political identity in that sense. It's quite an easy way. I mean, it's harmonious. It doesn't create controversies. Yeah, but Bangsa Malaysia creates controversies because there are so many contestations to it. But I think multiple identities, intersections of identities are not at loggerheads with the national identity of Bangsa Malaysia.
Maybe Netusha, do you have anything to comment to that? Respond to.
Okay, well, I think like maybe like a part of where I'm coming from is because I think that Bangsa Malaysia is like, and you know, this kind of like interrogation about wanting to build national identity in a society that is like so complex, and you know, there's a lot of like oppressed and vulnerable communities that are actively being excluded, and we enable like, and I think that Bangsa Malaysia and this idea of forming Malaysian identity is predicated upon the violent exclusion and erasure of people who do not fit into that category of being Malaysian. And this includes Malaysians born on this land, because I mean, like, they're born on this soil, but they are not considered Malaysian because one, they don't have a paper saying that they are Malaysian or ID card. And there could be so many reasons for it. Some of it is for sexist, patriarchal reasons, as we learned in the recent court case pushed forward by Family Frontiers. And this government had tried to actively like also exercise patriarchal violence, right, in this situation. Then we have refugees who are, you know, coming to this country as a result of forced migration, and because they feel that this is a Muslim majority country, therefore like it is their best option here and safest. But are they really safe? I don't think so. And we can get anecdotal evidence for how difficult their life is. We have issues of indigenous people in the depths of like the forest frontiers, or living between, or people living between the borders, right? And you know, all this movement of undocumented migrants and whatnot, we just like leave them unaddressed, but they are so salient. And I think that we've just become so desensitized to like how much violence has taken place on this land, and how blood-soaked all of it is. Testimony, Wang Kelian is one of these issues. Where does the issue of Wang Kelian and mass graves in Wang Kelian stand in like an issue like Bangsa Malaysia, right? This is what I mean by the need for like very tangible like confrontation with the overt violence, and that is where like what are the things we need to deal with? Policing, the disproportionate number of Malaysian Indian men dying in custody. But it's a problem that we all share. It's not just specifically to Malaysian Indians, right? Deaths in custody is not an issue that needs to be entirely racialized. But why I say there's a disproportionate number of Malaysian Indians. Why can't we deal with all these issues like and take them seriously? And before we can, and I'm not saying that it can't, this needs to be dealt with first before like we discuss like nation, right? But it has to happen like at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to have a pathetic like budget allocation like this recent one. You know, I have to say, like, having listened to it and reading the entire budget allocation, it's embarrassing. You know, I felt there's no other word for it besides being disgusted, angry, and feeling like I've been like stuck into like a portal and gone back into like this past, like monochrome past of like, you know, very overt racism and essentialization. And the fact that it can continue replicated by the highest powers with very little accountability and opposition that is a strong salient opposition is very concerning. We are not making enough progress on in the sense of building like social cohesion, national unity, simply because we are not actually actively sufficiently in the widest capacity to like do this. And that's where I think like would make this like conversation and pursuit like for national identity more relevant, in the sense that like the preoccupation, right, with this needs to come from a place of like praxis as well, rather than just like also thinking about looking into the past, to inform that praxis and correct like the historical injustices. So yeah, that's where I think like I would stop.
Yeah, so it's more about, if I understand what you're saying, is that addressing the underlying issues of why we couldn't have that kind of cohesion and unity of racism, discrimination, addressing those underlying issues first before we talk about how to have that kind of national unity. So maybe we can move on to one of the questions, I think, from the floor, maybe to James, on this question on impact of what we have talked about a little bit on the lack of national identity. How does it attribute and impact the Malaysian performance in terms of economy?
The short answer is that it has never really impacted on the economy. I think I like what Professor Rahman Embong said just now. I think the reality is that Malaysians, right, even throughout the years of the NEP, throughout the institutional racism built into the system, right, all of us has always held multiple identities. So this is very clear when you see Malaysian students coming together when they're outside Malaysia. They always call themselves Malaysians first, but the moment they land back in KLIA, suddenly, you know, they have a separate identity. So I think all of us have this multiple identities thing happening at all times. But coming back to your question about the impact of identities on the economy, the short answer is no, it doesn't really impact on the economy. The unique thing about the Malaysian economy is that for the longest time, the Malaysian economy is basically a state-run economy. I know it's a terrible thing to say. People always think that we are living in a free economy, but if you look at the statistics, you know, if you look at even Bangsa Malaysia today, you look at the 10 largest cap, 9 are actually GLCs. So the government has always taken a very big stake in the way that the Malaysian economy has worked. Where identity is important is probably at the symbolic stage. So for example, the head of all GLCs, all the large companies, as much as possible, they want to appoint a Malay person or a Muslim person to lead that organization. But as far as I know, in the business world, in the private economy, right, talent really does count. If you can do the job, you know, you will get hired. You may not be in the #1 position in the GLC, but again, that comes back to the earlier point when I talk about institutional structures. Those things are placed there to reinforce a certain view of Malaysia. The people, the elites in this country, they want Malaysia to represent a certain views. So this is where we've always had this issue of what does Malaysia mean to you? If you ask different ethnic groups in this country, even people of different ages, they will tell you very different things about what Malaysia is. This is of course not unique to Malaysia. Singapore has been grappling with this question for years. Indonesia, same thing. So most countries around the region, because of the way the boundaries were drawn at colonial times, this issue identity has always been there. But I think in the Malaysian case, what is unique is that how much this is driven by the elites in this country, how much it is cemented in the system, that all the other voices are sort of pushed apart. And this way, I talk about, that's the reason why my last comment just now was on capitalism and how new technologies and social media are being used to shape our ideas of what this Malaysian identity is. And my take is that capitalism, the way it's structured in Malaysia is not very good for us in terms of national integration, national unity. And that new things like social media is used to divide rather than bring people together.
Are there any successful national unity that you have seen in other countries? This is a question from the floor. So James.
I'll let my good friend Rahman get my good friend Rahman answer.
Okay, sure. Prof Rahman, over to you.
Is there a good model of
Yes.
national unity from other countries?
The countries.
Is that's a question, right? Well, let's put it this way. There is no ideal model of national unity from anywhere. A seemingly good model has got its own drawbacks. For example, like Indonesia, which has got a nation since 1928 under Sumpah Pemuda. I mean, in the main, they have got a national identity. But of course, there are problems of minorities, of religious groups, etc. Of those in the provinces, you have see it like Aceh, you have got Papua, I can't remember what they call it in Indonesian. But you have got that problem. Okay, let's take Thailand. Thailand seemingly appears to have national identity, but there are problems in the south. They've got Muslim separatism, etc. Look at China, 55 ethnic groups who come as the major dominant ethnic group of over 90%, and they give autonomy to the various ethnic groups, and for certain regions they have got the special arrangements like Hong Kong, Macau, and all that. In the main, they manage that quite well, but of course there are voices and struggles among the ethnic minorities, especially in Xinjiang. I mean, there are various reasons. There are issues of terrorism, etc., etc. But the world outside, especially the West, talk about genocide and all that. But I think you can't point to a perfect model. But what about the West? The West, they say that Switzerland, which is multilingual, but it has got to depend on its history that leads to that kind of creation of a model. England, Britain, there are problems with Wales, with Scotland, etc., etc. So there isn't. So we are not looking for a perfect model, but we are looking for a workable model, where in the main you can overcome and discriminate against. I mean, you overcome discrimination, you overcome inequalities, but those respect human rights, etc. I mean, this is the gist, I think, of what Netusha was saying. These issues of human rights, when you're talking about refugees, you're talking about people on the borders without statelessness, etc. So if the state takes care of those things, then I think that's why in my paper I said that how people perceive the treatment of the state towards them, that matters a lot. And that affects unity, the sentiments toward unity, towards affiliation to the country, etc., etc. And some people may feel that they don't belong here, they want to leave. So it matters a lot. If the state is enlightened and implement in reality, not just in rhetoric, the question of anti-discrimination, address inequality, respect for human rights, for gender rights, for ethnic rights, etc., etc. I think that sets the first precondition for forging a national identity that can be in the main, not all, in the main acceptable to the various people. But I think some of the things that Netusha raised will be discussed, I think, tomorrow on the question of indigenous groups, etc. But coming,
Yes.
I just want to say, can I just have a minute? Because I want to respond to James on the issue when he responded to the question whether
Yes, sure, go ahead, Prof.
national identity will have an impact upon the economy. I think whether, well, is the economy stupid, right? I mean, in that sense, because the economy does not firstly respond to national identity, but the economy responds to good policies. Whether the policy is good or not, will bring profit to them or not. And whether it is open, transparent, competitive, whether there is rasuah or not. I mean, corruption or not. I mean, I think that matters first. And then, of course, the other things matter too. But if ethnic identity or national identity does not contribute towards merit, then they are concerned. But I think the first thing is the openness of the system, of policies, whether the policies are favorable for economic development and growth, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, Netusha, I think you have a comment on the same point.
Yeah, I do actually. I do agree that there is no perfect model, but we can definitely see like that there are individuals and groups that actually are working towards building solutions and interrogating statehood in ways that, you know, are being they're actually challenging like the existing order. A lot of this like can be found especially in the United States, which is not a perfect country. It has like a lot of issues, and you know, compounded by the fact it's like a settler colonial state, obviously, right? But here's the thing, like we have like, so there's just so much of resources, and that is a lot of what was foundational to Tanpa Perkauman or pioneering anti-racist work in Malaysia. That's people-centric and oriented towards practical, tangible like steps towards addressing discrimination. And I think like the fact that there is that room to explore and to create all these manuals and toolkits and resources that are free on the internet, and you have like a variety of thinkers, scholars, and activists in the US like working on this. This is something that we lack in Malaysia. Not only just the kind of expertise, but also a kind of political will. And it's not about how intellectually capable they are, but it's like a lack of political will because too many people benefit from the existing structures, particularly like the ruling elite, right? And another point I think like, which is a bit unpopular that I want to make here, and it's relevant because like, another way to look at this whole issue of statehood, I think, is that I think Prof Rahman made an excellent point about this like renewed like principles and like terms and conditions, right? Or basically like a new social contract, word that's very you know, distorted in the Malaysian context. So basically that's what it is, right? But nation states, in my opinion, and from my study of like the whole idea, I kind of take out a bit of like Tongchai Winnie Chaku's like idea here in Siam Map, which is that, you know, I think every nation state model is basically essentially settler colonial in its logic, including Malaysia, you know, because there's always a constant need to even as we talk about inclusion, exclusion needs to happen. And we're constantly in the process of dispossessing and outlying because we are still using the same political mechanizations. And I think it's like a really huge undertaking for us to really like rethink. And that's why I think like what some of the anti-racist work that is going on in the US by these groups and collectives. And I recommend definitely starting with Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, as a starting point, and then going further and exploring like more of these concepts. And we need to like get to work. And I mean, in Imagine Malaysia's case, and with IDEAS, we are getting to work already, right? So but yeah, and of course, like I need to signal boost architects of diversity here, and we are currently running like this workshop with 40 amazing students between the ages of 18 and 25 who are the next generation of Malaysians who are going to do this work, and we are equipping them with those skills. And Dr. Lee Hock On will be joining us in a couple of weeks, and as well as Dr. Ananti Aramya. So, you know, I think that all hope is not lost, but definitely we need to like, you know, there's definitely need a way to change the way we are doing things. And I think that's the way to move forward.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think there's a suggestion from the floor as well on the Singapore model, talking about Lee Kuan Yew opted for unity by identifying all ethnic groups as Singaporeans. What are your thoughts on this, Prof Rahman, and maybe other panelists as well? Prof Rahman, you're muted.
What is it?
The Singapore model. On the Singapore model, what do you think about the Singapore model in terms of uniting the different ethnic groups as Singaporeans?
The Singapore model in terms of advancing its economy to become an advanced, developed economy within a certain period of time is something. Now, regarding the model of unity among the various ethnic groups there, I think that there is something to learn from it, especially. And is it a Chinese dominant or dominated state, or is it a state which recognizes the rights of the different ethnic groups? Well, I think it is not a Chinese dominated state, though Chinese are the majority. I think that is one. Then the policies in the main appear to be acceptable. But there are certain things that has got to be looked into. For example, the question of positions in critical institutions like the military, the police, etc. So some are acceptable. Some I think have got to be looked at more critically. That's my response.
I think just to move on to, I think we have been talking about all the racism and discrimination, and also some issues of having a nationhood and a state as well, and national unity. So just coming back to what Prof Rahman has highlighted about COVID-19 and how there's an increased solidarity during this time, where I think James also talked about social media and how that has impacted social cohesion and also national unity. James, would you like to talk further and comment on this in terms of the impact of social media and how it has changed national unity during this time, especially like during COVID-19?
Sure, but I think given the time constraints, I just want to talk about the way forward. I think the reality for the Malaysian situation, as I mentioned, we all have multiple identities. I think the important thing is that the state must be neutral when it comes to the issue of national identity. We basically need two things. We need sort of a great minimum national narrative of what Malaysia is. And after that, the state must be neutral. I think one of the reasons why we can't agree to a narrative of what Malaysia is and what it means to be Malaysian is because the state is widely perceived and behave as working on behalf of the Malay community or the Malay agenda. The reality is that if the state is neutral, in other words, the state doesn't take any sides, then I think a lot of the issues of the national narrative and what it means to be Malaysia will resolve by itself. Because I think at the core, at the very core, right, at the minimum, everybody understands what Malaysia is. Because when you travel outside Malaysia, you carry a red color passport, you are Malaysian. You may be from Selangor, maybe from Pahang, Sabah, it doesn't matter. But there is such a thing as a Malaysian. I visited a lot of countries. I'm sure you've visited a lot of countries as well. Malaysians always get together, right? They may disagree on the politics, but they'll come together, do a potluck or whatever. So there is a minimum base for creating this Malaysia identity. The reason why this thing cannot move forward is because the state does not take a neutral approach to this identity. The state is trying to impose its view of what national identity is, and that is based on the ethnic criteria and economic benefits and other benefits attached to this ethnic criteria. And increasingly, they're imposing Islamic or a religious identity to the Malaysian identity. And because of that, you get reactions from the ground up for people who disagree with this view of what Malaysia is. So if the state is neutral, then I think a lot of the issues that we discussed in this in this panel discussion this afternoon, a lot of it will be resolved. So I think, yes, there is such a thing as being a Malaysian, but the state itself, its view of how a Malaysian is or what Malaysia is, it is skewed in such a way that a lot of us disagree with it. So that's the reason why we are questioning this idea of national identity.
Thank you, James. Yeah, maybe to Netusha, what do you think are some of the ways that we can reconcile and also to move forward in terms of having national unity?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I actually really like what James said just now, because that's what but to get to the point where building it's a whole theoretical construction in itself, the neutral state, right? And what would it take to reach to the point of a neutral state? Would it require revolution? This is maybe stage theory might answer this as a question. So, but peace-loving people do not want revolution. So what are the other ways of transformative action that can take place? Most certainly, I think our our ongoing program with the students, Akar Umbi Kita, is a prime example of how we can move forward and start really, instead of just as James Prof Rahman also mentioned, we have so much disagreements about what is it that entails Bangsa Malaysia or Malaysian national identity. So I think that programs like this, building the capacity to think and voice and articulate, to write, to conceptualize in new ways would definitely be the steps we need to take. Looking to the past, as even yesterday's webinar, Prof Jomo mentioned this quite very eloquently, and we see that history has a place in all this, and history combined with the tools for transformative justice and utilizing these anti-racist resources to fit the Malaysian context, that's definitely where it's headed, and we should be headed, and we must push forward. Holding our politicians more accountable, definitely we need to do that more, call them out, and yeah, that's where I would end, and that's also my conclusion from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Netusha. Yeah, I think in view of time, I think James needs to go in a few minutes. Maybe James, do you have any concluding remarks before I pass it back to Prof Rahman to talk about our way forward?
So my conclusion remarks is that I think this sort of open discussion, I think, is extremely important. I think we need to hold more honest conversations, not only among the so-called Bangsa crowd, but I think it's important that this sort of conversation is held across throughout Malaysia. I think the reality is that if you were to hold this conversation in Kelantan, or you hold this conversation in Johor, whatever it is, right? Very often the conclusions you come up will probably be very similar. And that I think most people at the end of the day, most rational people at the end of the day, they want the state to be neutral, I think, at the end of the day. It is true a significant portion of the people benefit from the NEP and the Bumiputera policy. But at the end of the day, right, they do understand that that policy has too many contradictions. It is not gonna lead Malaysia anywhere. A very, very simple thing can tell people is that, if you talk about keeping the Bumiputera system forever, right? Right now, approximately 70% of the population will get quote unquote a free meal. In about 30 years time, you will reach 80%. I mean, do you want a situation where, in the future, right, where the country itself cannot afford this sort of policies anymore, and that everyone will pay, So I think if you have this sort of conversation, especially among, among the whole population of Malaysia, I think is a really good thing, because I think very often, right, people in this country, they don't think, they rely on the social media to tell them how to think. And if they're not part of the conversation, they don't start thinking. So what I find is that when I talk to people, right, you put them on a spot, you force them to think, and usually, despite what everyone says, I can tell you, usually the conclusion is actually quite a rational conclusion. So thank you very much. And I'm really, really pleased to be part of this panel. Congratulations, Professor Rahman, on a really good paper.
Thank you, James, for your insights and contribution today here. Maybe now we pass to Prof Rahman. Any thoughts on how do we move forward? How do we reconcile, and how do we enhance the national unity? And maybe you can unpack some of the policies, recommendation that you put forth in the paper as well. I think there are some steps that you have put forth.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I will be very concise. First, I agree with what Prof Shin said just now, that this kind of conversation has got to go on, and it shouldn't stop here. And open, rational, evidence-based, and principle-based discussion or conversation, building a new kind of narrative about our nation on the way forward, I think is very important to move beyond what we have just done. That's number one. Number two is about, at the core of it is the role of the state. Yes, I agree with that. Can the state be neutral, and not just be neutral, be just, democratic, enlightened? Can it be so? Well, I think the answer is for those who hold the levers of power to answer that. But there are many issues there. But the point is that there is the wish, there's our desire that the state should be neutral on issues of identity. It has got to be just. It has got to be democratic. It has got to be enlightened to ensure that citizenry, whatever identities they belong to, enjoy the benefits of being citizens of the state. I think that's number two. Number three is the people themselves. How to bring about pressures on the state so that they act and behave in the way that they should behave, that citizens want. I think the active citizenry through civil society and other means is very important, and they have got to come up to say what they want, to say what they think, and to say so rationally and in a civil manner, so that their voices can be heard and be taken note of by the leaders and by those who hold the levers of power in the state. And number four is that the young people, and I'm happy that we have a young people, and not only just young, but also a woman in the panel, Netusha, is good. And we need the voices of the young to come forward. The views that I have in the paper is too detailed to come forward, to say here. But the point is that I suggest towards the end about Bangsa Malaysia, why not we do some stock taking based on evidence, a nationwide referendum, if you like, you want to call it that way, to way forward for the next 50 years. We have come already 60 years or 50 years. Why not have a referendum? Because in the beginning it was just said by the top. Why not let the below, the people, say their views through the referendum, and to stop taking that sense, and then we can be very sure about what they want and how their specific identities can jive in with the national identity. On that note, I would like to say very much, thank you very much again to IDEAS. Thank you to both of you, to Prof James, long time no see, and to Netusha for your comments, and also the questions from the participants, which we didn't have much time to deal with, but nevertheless, I think IDEAS will share their comments and questions from the participants to me and to the panelists as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Rahman. Maybe to Netusha, any concluding remarks to the audience?
I think I'll just reiterate that, the conversation is complicated, but definitely a more people-centric, action-oriented approach to accompany like this, my headphones low battery, to accompany, the critical thinking and intellectualizing of like the state, and the possibility of like the neutral state is very interesting and something that we should explore in our context. But yeah, there's this work that is coming along and developing, anti-racist work in Malaysia, and it's just the beginning. And yes, please follow Imagine Malaysia and our current campaign with IDEAS Tanpa Perkauman. And I think that we are making progress in the sense we are able to even have this conversation openly and critique violence and these like different like variations of violence and how to like overcome them, so that we have a much more resilient and more united society. But yeah, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's a true privilege to be, I guess, a non-professor between two professors and having this conversation. So yeah, thank you, IDEAS.
Thank you, Netusha. Yeah, thanks. I think the conversation has been really about having an honest conversation about what it means to be a Malaysian as well, right? Everyone has their own experiences that we need to share with one another, and about the neutrality of the state as well in enhancing and ensuring that the building of Bangsa Malaysia actually comes into fruition. Thank you everyone for your time today, and I would like to join me to thank our panelists today, Professor Rahman, James, and also Netusha for their insights and contribution throughout the discussion. It has been wonderful to have all of them with different diverse backgrounds and also diverse opinions and different generations as well. I think that is really the kind of conversation that we should have, it's not just about differences in terms of ethnicity, but it's differences in terms of region, in terms of others, in terms of generation as well. Thank you all for your time, and I will pass this time over to Vice Navi.
Thank you, Yashin, and thank you to the wonderful panelists and to Prof. Rahman. Congratulations on the publication of your paper. Please do join us again tomorrow as we wrap up this project with one last webinar looking at the contesting Bumiputra identity among Orang Asli and the indigenous people of Sabah and Sarawak. If you would like to download the full version of Prof. Rahman's paper, you can visit our website at ideas.org.my. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.